If you're looking to buy a home in California this year, then I have good news and bad news for you. Let's start with the bad news. The bad news is that despite elevated mortgage rates, California's home prices are also still on the rise. However, the good news is that housing inventory is also on the rise as well, which is giving more negotiating power to home buyers. So for example, homes on average are selling for slightly less than the seller's asking price on average. In today's video, I'm going to share exactly what's happening right now in the California housing market based on a brand new report. Also, if you're thinking about buying or selling a home in California, then please email me at jason@meetjasonwalter.com or check out my website, which is realestateteamfinder.com. With that said, I appreciate you guys so much for watching today's video. And let's begin. This, by the way, is from a new report from the California Association of Realtors. I'll provide a high-level overview about what's happening right now. So again, this was just posted a couple of days ago. We're going to talk about single-family existing houses, therefore excluding brand new homes. So for the month of December, home sales increased by nearly 20% compared to December of 2023. We'll talk about that here in a little bit. Based on home prices, or the median sold price, in California, that's $861,000, an increase of 5% year over year. That's basically twice as high compared to the national average at around $400,000. So we definitely pay to live in California. The month supply is at 2.7 months. That is an increase of nearly 4% year over year, but actually decreased compared to the previous month. So for example, back in November, the month supply was at 3.3 months. Now it decreased quite a bit down to 2.7 this December. And the significance regarding this is that a more balanced housing market is in the range of 4 to 5 months, not 2.7 months. Every market's different. I'll share county level stats in my next video, which I'll post here very soon. Also, based on the median days in the market, how fast or how slow houses are selling, it's taken around 4 weeks to sell a house because days in the market's at 31 days. That is a big increase compared to a year ago, up by 19%. But looking at the actual number of days, it's not a big difference. So for example, back in December of 2023, it took about 5 days faster to sell a house. So it's only taking about 5 days longer right now. Okay, let's talk about home sales, and we'll talk about home prices here very, very soon. So here's something that really caught my attention. Actually, there's two things really. So looking at the number of closed home sales for the entire year last year compared to previous years, it's basically the first annual increase in about 3 years. So home sales compared to the previous years have been decreasing for about 2 years, but last year we saw the first increase in 3 years. On top of that, based on the seasonally adjusted annualized rate at 268,000 units, so basically they look at the current sales pace in December, multiply that by 12, do a seasonal adjustment. If you have the same pace of home sales throughout the year, you would have around 268,000 for the year. That, by the way, is a 5-month high, which is unusual, right? Because home sales tend to decrease in December, and here we are at basically the highest levels in about 5 months. And again, up by 19.8% year over year. Here's something we also know as well. Sales at the top end of the market are increasing big time, especially when we look at sales at the more affordable range. So home sales this December compared to 12 months ago surged by 38%. That's sales for over $2 million. In the range of $1 million to $2 million, they increased by 26%. And of course, sales for less than $400,000 are increasing greatly because, of course, our average home price is around $800,000. So this is overall impacting the national or the statewide median sold price because we're seeing a strong increase in sales of multi-million-dollar properties and, of course, decreases at the lower end of the market. In fact, so much so that around 1/3 of all home sales this December were for over $1 million. Last year at this time, it was at 29%. In contrast, in December 2024, sales for less than $500,000 only represented about 24% of all closed home sales this last year. In contrast, in December 2024, only 24% of all home sales sold for less than $500,000. Let's also have a look at a future projection of closed home sales, that is pending home sales. When home buyers get their offers accepted, that's a new pending home sale, that decreased by 1.5% year over year. That's the first time it has decreased compared to the previous year in about 6 months. This implies that closed home sales in January and also potentially in February could remain relatively low, given that pendings decreased by 1.5%. But on top of that, mortgage rates increased quite a bit in January and also in December as well, which could cause a kind of a muted effect regarding our housing market here in California and frankly, nationwide as well. All right, let's talk about home prices based on the median sold price. That increase compared to the previous year now for 18 consecutive months. So 18 consecutive months, home prices have increased. There was only about, I think, 6 months in which home prices decreased compared to the previous year, but that was back in 2023, early 23. What also really caught my attention as well is that home prices increased from November to December. It increased by 1%. This really caught my attention because we are seeing this elevated mortgage rate environment, but despite that, home prices still increased compared to November, and again, up by 5% year over year. All right, so I want to share how these numbers compare to years past, and I'm going to kind of provide a shortened version of this because I tend to take a deep dive into this, but I just want to provide a high-level overview about what's happening right now, how this compares to years past. So again, we're at $861,000 was the median sold price in California. That is a decrease compared to the all-time record highs that was set back in May of 2024 at $908,000. Something to keep in mind though is that home prices tend to decrease in December compared to the spring home buying season. So I'll have to see what this looks like once we approach the spring months this year, how it compares to the all-time record high that was set 1 year ago. In any case, like I mentioned, home prices increased by 5% year over year, and that also marks the 18th consecutive month in which prices rose compared to the previous year. However, it's lower compared to the long-run average. So for example, based on my nerdy Excel formula there, the average increase from December compared to the previous December, going back to the year of 2010, is a whopping big increase. I mean, a huge increase, up by 7.6%. So on average, home prices tend to increase by 7.6% in December, whereas this December, it only increased by 5%. This, by the way, is a little bit lower compared to what happened last year. Last year, this time, we were up by 6.4%, but we're actually much better than the decreases we saw from November of 2022 through June of 2023. Back then, we saw a decrease in the California's median sold price from 12 months ago. In fact, in November of 2022, based on my nerdy analysis here, that was the first year-over-year decrease since February of 2012. So we saw a real estate market correction in California, but basically it only lasted for about 8 months. And that, of course, is because back in July, it increased to 0.2%, which obviously is much lower than the 5% gains we saw this December. Also, looking at the month-to-month change, again, like I mentioned, it increased by 1%, quite a bit better than the 4% decrease we saw in November, but a gain of 1%. This is something that really caught my attention as well. I always thought that home prices tend to decrease in December, but the data doesn't support that because the average November through December change, the month-to-month change in December, going back to the year of 2010, is an increase of 2.1%, whereas this month, it actually increased by only 1%. Therefore, big picture regarding this is that home prices are still on the rise, right? But we're seeing this kind of like deceleration in which home prices are increasing, but increasing at a lower rate compared to the long run average. On top of that, looking at the gain in prices over the past 5 years, we're seeing an increase of 40%. Back in December of 2019, back then it was only at $614,000. All right, if you guys are getting any value out of today's video, then please hit the like button. I greatly appreciate that. Let's also talk about the sale price to final list price ratio. As I mentioned at the very beginning of this video, because we're seeing this rise of inventory levels, home buyers have more negotiating power, and the data kind of supports that because homes on average sold for 98.7% of the seller's final list price. This means on average this December, they sold for 1.3 percentage points less than the seller's asking price. And also that ratio at 98.7% is actually the lowest level since February of 2023. And this obviously is much different compared to the peak back in the spring home buying season of 21 and 2022. Back then, homes on average were selling for nearly 5% over asking. Now they're selling for slightly less than the asking price. Now, speaking of that, the share of houses that sold over asking price this December decreased to a 22-month low. This is a little bit deceiving in my opinion because we're tend to see, again, like the housing market tends to kind of slow down in November through really January. So the share of houses selling over the seller's asking price tends to be at a lower share during the winter months and tends to be at a higher share compared to the spring home buying season. So for example, back in April of 2022, 73% of all houses that sold that month sold for over the seller's asking price. In contrast, this December, only around 1/3 sold for over asking. That is a slight decrease compared to 12 months ago. Back then, it was at 34.3%. Also, clearly, as you guys can see, over the past couple of years, the share of houses selling over the seller's asking price tends to peak during the spring home buying season, which is right there, and of course, right there as well. So again, we'll have to see how this compares when looking at April, May, and June to see if this number increases. If history repeats itself like it did last year, years past, of course, looking at pre-COVID levels, the share the share of houses selling over asking tends to increase during the spring home buying season. All right, let's talk about inventory numbers. And this is pretty eye-opening to say the least. We're not seeing a big increase. So the month supply is relatively flat year over year. It's at 2.7 months. 1 year ago, 2.6 months. Relatively flat for quite some time, in fact. It's also more or less in line with pre-COVID levels as well. The month supply in California, on average, is around 3 to about 4 months. Also, just for comparison's sake, look at this. The peak regarding the month supply was at 16.6 months. That was set back in January of 2008. And of course, that caused home prices to basically crater, down by 42% from January 2008 through January of 2009. So if you guys think there's going to be a housing market crash in California, my question for you guys is, I'm not rubbing this in, by the way. I would love to see our housing market, California, our housing market in general, national or nationwide, to be more affordable so people can afford to buy a house. Realize the American dream. I would love that. But the reality here is that we're not going to see a crash in the California housing market because it comes down to basic economics, the balance between supply and demand, right? Supply, 2.7 months. Back during the peak of 2008, it was at 16.6 months. In other words, housing supply was basically 6 times greater then than it is right now. Now, speaking of housing supply, let's have a look at altosresearch.com, looking at California as a whole. This is actually a little bit more updated than the California Association of Realtors. This covers the week ended January 17th this year. There was 37,000 houses for sale in California. That's higher compared to the past several years, right? 1 year ago, it was at around 29,000. 2023 this time, around 32,000 as well. But of course, way higher compared to 22 and 21 when we had 3% rates. But at 37,000 houses for sale this January, this is still lagging behind pre-COVID levels back in January 31st, 2020, right before COVID. Back then we had 42,000 houses for sale. So even though inventory is about basically a 4-year high right now during the same time frame, we're still lagging behind pre-pandemic levels. This is much different compared to Texas, for example. Looking at Texas as a whole, inventory is basically at the highest levels for the month of January since at least January of 2020. So in other words, they have more inventory compared to pre-COVID levels in Texas, but also Florida as well. So for example, in Florida, let's take a look at that. In Florida, inventory is absolutely piling up big time. They basically had the highest level on record, since early 2020, higher than any other week since January 31st, 2020. Back then, 74,000 houses for sale. And of course, right now, approaching 91,000. Much different housing market in Florida, Texas, compared to what we're seeing here in California. Having said that, even though we are still lagging behind compared to what we saw back in 2019 or early 2020, it's encouraging to see that we have more inventory compared to 1 year ago. So this actually marks the 10th consecutive month in which inventory increased by more than doubled or double digits from 12 months ago. It increased by 28.8% this December compared to December of 2023. This, of course, is much better than the huge decrease of inventory that we saw back in 2020 and 21. Back then, inventory decreased by about 50% every single month for about a year. As the number of houses for sale has been increasing for quite some time in the state, it's taking longer for houses to sell. And therefore, that's good news for home buyers because they're not rushing to buy a house right now because it's taking about 31 days to sell a house, which is approximately 5 days longer compared to 12 months ago. As houses are taking a little bit longer to sell, we're also seeing more price reductions as well in the state. It's at around 27% right now. This is according to altusresearch.com. Compare that to 1 year ago, we're at 25%. In 2023, that ratio was at 32%. So higher compared to last year, but lower compared to 2 years ago. Obviously, we're going to be way higher compared to 2022 and early 2021. But also looking at pre-COVID levels, back in January 31st, 2020, that share was only 23.7%. So the share of price drops right now is higher compared to last year, but also higher compared to 2020. With that said, if you guys are interested in buying or selling a house in California, then please email me at jason@meetjasonwalter.com. Also, if you guys got any value out of today's video, then please hit the like button. I greatly appreciate that. Also, consider subscribing as well. Also have a second YouTube channel as well, which is called Sacramento Home Goals. I'm trying to post a video there once per week, so please take a look at that. I'll provide a link in the video description below as well. With that said, I hope you guys have an amazing day. Thank you everyone for watching today's video. I appreciate you.